Hello and welcome to Earnscliffe Strategy Group's ongoing webinar series, Canada in Uncertain Times. My name is Alan Gregg. I'm one of 41 principals in the Earnscliffe Strategy Group. For those of you who might not be familiar with our organization, we're a public affairs strategic advisory company with specialization in government relations, strategic communications, and public opinion research. This week, our topic is confronting the virus, what Canadians are saying about the ongoing impact of COVID. I'm joined by an all-star panel, Stephanie Constable, who is one of our Ottawa-based principals and member of the public opinion research team, also the vice chair of our board. Doug Anderson, who is also Ottawa-based public opinion research unit, in fact, is the business lead of that unit. Hilary Martin, rising superstar in our public opinion research unit, joining us here for the first time as part of this, and old friend, superstar, Susan Delacourt, who is the national opinion columnist for the largest newspaper in Canada, the Toronto Star. From time to time, we conduct our own nationwide research to get a better understanding of the public opinion environment, the landscape that we're dealing with for our clients on a day-to-day basis. We've got a nationwide study that we want to showcase today. What we're going to do is we're going to show you in 4 different segments or parts what our findings are, and again, call upon our panelists to discuss the implications of these. As all of our research, it's a robust nationwide study that has a sample size of almost 2,000 online survey drawn from our partner Leger Marketing's ongoing panel, significantly oversampled in various regions so that we can drill down and analyze on a regional basis and then reweighted to reflect the population as it stands. Opinion pollsters are fond of saying that survey research is only a snapshot in a point of time, and it's good to remind you that. And as things are changing so rapidly, as I said, we've done 2 pieces of research. You can see the first, May 6th to 14th, and the more recent one, October 16th to 22nd. The reason we want to point this out is that different things were happening at that point in time. The first research we saw had the first wave of the virus had pretty much peaked and things were starting to get a little bit better. In this particular instance, we're right in the middle of the escalation of the second wave. So that might bear on some of the findings, and I just want you to keep that, that in mind. So without that, and without further ado, let's start by talking about how Canada is doing in handling the pandemic. Steph, you want to walk us through some of the charts?
Absolutely. Just clicking through to my slides here. So thank you, Alan. Really excited to be sharing these results with everyone. And we'll be sort of highlighting some of the differences in the data over time now in the 2 waves of our research. What we're seeing is that there's continued broad concern about COVID, but it's slightly less acute than it was in the spring. Essentially, when we ask Canadians what is the top issue or the most top of mind concern for you, COVID-19, the pandemic, is still the top of mind issue. We've got 45% of Canadians who are naming that unaided. Now, it is a slight decline from the spring, 12%, but I don't want to understate the fact that this is still the main concern for people. The second highest concern was the economy at 13%. Now, that's not to say that people are necessarily thinking about COVID just in the context of health. You know, when you ask people about COVID and the things that they're worried about, the economy, things like long-term care facility, all the things we're going to be talking about are also things that get sort of lumped into that answer. And so it's not necessarily separate of the economy. We also asked how they believe this crisis compares to a large crisis in World War II. And fewer, again, slightly less acute, believe that this is the biggest crisis Canada has faced since World War II. But still, you can see that this is something that is a very high concern for Canadians. We asked Canadians how they're feeling, how they're being impacted by the pandemic. And 24% of Canadians are saying that they've suffered a major impact both personally and financially. Now, 24% might not seem like a very high number, but when you combine those 2 impacts, it's quite a significant portion of the Canadian population. And that number has actually remained static since the spring, when it was at 25%. This particular wave, we added two new metrics. We asked Canadians whether they felt that the worst was yet to come, and we see that 2/3 of Canadians do believe that it is. And 78% are also believe that COVID-19 is more dangerous than the seasonal flu. Now, there was an interesting sort of dichotomy in the analysis that we detected in the spring. We asked Canadians a number of different attitudinal statements, and what we found is that 67% of Canadians currently just want everything to go back to the way it was. And this is an increase of 9% since the spring. To the other side, though, is that 3/4 of Canadians see this crisis as an opportunity to make some major changes to Canadian society. And so it was an interesting sort of dichotomy for us. And it does kind of make sense when you think about it, the sense that, you know, we do want to see some sense of normalcy, but at the same time, you know, we were asked to stay home initially and had a chance to reflect on our priorities, our values, and sort of make potentially in our minds anyway, a decision to do things a little differently. We did add another metric this time that is how are you feeling about the future? And we see that 62%, which is an increase of 7%, are more frightened about the future that we're facing. So it's certainly, you know, as I said before, something that is preoccupying Canadians and something that has had a major impact on their psyche.
Just, I want to ask you a question on that before we get to the next section, Stephanie, because for some people, they might see that as a contradiction. People saying, I want everything just to go back the way it was, which suggests kind of a nostalgic desire. Yet 75% saying, you know, this is an opportunity to do things very, very different, forward looking. What's going on in the mindset of the average Canadian there? They're thinking two different things at two different levels?
I think that it's just impacted people in such a profound way that, and it's now, you know, it's been so long that we've kind of been living in this weird different dimension. You know, we started with the shutdown and everyone was requested to stay home, and this has gone on probably longer than any of us imagined. You know, I think back to March when we were asked to work from home, and I thought it would be 2 weeks. And so after all this time now, we've been through a number of different changes in that time. And I think it initially sort of made everyone sort of reflect on, you know, you're at home, what's important to you? You know, people are facing different circumstances. There are some who are living through this crisis and facing a lot of challenges. This has not been easy for people. And so I think it's caused people to reflect. I don't necessarily see those two things at odds. I think that the normalcy that we're looking for is just less of the fatigue, less of the uncertainty, and you know, just a sense of, you know, going back or just not having those things to think about. But it doesn't mean that when we do get to what that new normal is, we might not make changes in our lives as a result.
Yeah, cultural historians have talked about the impact that the war, the depression had on an entire generation, completely changed their outlook. I mean, could this be the same kind of inflection point, you think, for Canadians as a society?
I really do. You know, you think about the things that are going on. We've got organizations like Shopify who closed their office buildings, and I think that this is the pivotal moment of a bit of a shift in the way that people will work, how they'll interact with each other, and it'll be certainly interesting to see as we go forward, for sure.
Now, I could add something to that.
Sure.
Sorry, I just wanted to point out, I agree with everything that Steph said on this, is that these two questions, when we cross-tabulate them together, end up explaining almost the whole population. What we found is that there are, you know, some proportion who agree with both of these statements, but really there is a significant chunk of the population, about 25%, who agree that this is an opportunity to make major changes in society, but are not among the 67% who agree that they just want things to go back the way they are. They do not agree with that statement. So there is, like, return to normalcy is like a baseline, but there is definitely a decided push towards doing something different.
Now, our colleague Hilary Martin has drilled down and taken a much closer look on how different segments of society are being affected in different ways by the virus. So Hilary, Why don't you join us and walk us through that?
For sure. I mean, as you were saying, Alan, it made total sense to break some of these attitudinal statements down by the demographic variables, because we know COVID has disproportionately affected women, racialized individuals, people with children. So we started from that point, and taking a look at this first question, I'm frightened about the future that we're facing. Of course, you know, we had the majority of Canadians agreeing with that statement, but we do see women agreeing in greater numbers and more strongly than men, which I think makes sense when you consider what we know about, you know, women's job losses and losses in hours worked over the pandemic, just as, you know, one example of something that might make them a little bit more pessimistic about the future. And in a similar vein, on the next slide, this question of, you know, just wanting everything to go back to normal, you know, women, again, a bit more likely to agree with that statement, strongly agree with that statement than men. But what I found particularly compelling is we broke this down by gender and by parental status. And we found that women with children are by far the most likely to strongly agree that they just want everything to go back to the way it was. And again, this makes total sense to me. I just read a report from RBC this morning that explained that women with children are leaving the workforce at a disproportionately high rate compared to their peers. And so, you know, faced with additional childcare burdens, loss of work, you know, being forced to make that choice between staying at home and caring for children and going to work, it's not surprising for me that women with children are saying, yeah, I want my old life back. And it's also, you know, worth considering that while people want things to return to normal, it's also, this pandemic is causing us to rethink our priorities. I'm sure everyone who's, you know, spent the last few months living under this could agree with that statement. And women, again, more likely to agree with that statement than men. And one thing worth noting, I think, is that racialized women are more likely to strongly agree with that statement than white women and men overall. And finally, as we were referring to earlier, that interesting dichotomy of both wanting things to return to normal and a significant chunk of the population saying this crisis is an opportunity for major changes. There are people who are perhaps more stronger advocates for change. We see women a little bit more likely to agree with that statement than men. And we also see that racialized women are more likely to strongly agree with that statement than white women and men overall. So what this tells me is that there are people in society who need more help because they've been more adversely affected. And there are people who are going to be stronger advocates for change. But perhaps encouragingly, there is still broad-based support for major changes in society, which is quite interesting. And I think perhaps presents a window of opportunity for people to be a bit more ambitious about the changes that they might put forward in the future.
Because we've known through the epidemiological data that this is not an equal opportunity infector, that the most vulnerable in society are also the most vulnerable to the virus. I mean, what you're showing us there, Hillary, is that it also affects the outlook and mindset of different segments of the society in different ways. Did any of that surprise you?
You know, it didn't surprise me. I think much like Stephanie was speaking to earlier about how this pandemic has shifted the outlook for so many. I think for some, maybe they see positive changes in that, but a lot of people see negative changes. And without greater action to tackle some of the existing inequities in our society that the pandemic has exacerbated, you know, women with children, if they don't feel like there's hope that perhaps we'll get a national childcare strategy or something to that effect, the future doesn't look as rosy as it once had, perhaps.
Now, Hillary and Stephanie and Doug, you know that it's only a matter of time before she has all of our jobs, eh? That's guaranteed, absolutely. Thanks so much, Hillary. I really appreciate the insight. Steph, continue on, because what we did in our first study, and now we've tracked now, is the performance rating of various actors and players in the management of the virus. So show us what you found.
Yeah, and it's, I feel sort of bad. You know, we called it heroes and villains to be a little, you know, push a little bit of buttons, but there are definitely a lot of differences in the data. What we see is that 91% of Canadians agree that frontline medical professionals are doing an excellent or good job responding to the pandemic. And they are by far the group of people who have been handling the pandemic that have the greatest support among Canadians. In terms of the levels of government, this is again the combined excellent and good performance. I know you probably will see the declines over time from when we asked this question in the spring, but I think that these are still generally strong numbers for each level of government in terms of dealing with the pandemic. A little bit stronger for the provincial government than the federal government, but again, still pretty high numbers. The actors or the group that still has the lowest ratings is owners and operators of long-term care facilities. This number has decreased again 2% since the spring. There's no shortage of stories and news about this, and it's certainly something that Doug is going to be exploring in more depth later in this conversation. And then we looked at a couple of actors that I'm showing here. I'm highlighting just the differences in their excellent rating because their excellent, combined excellent and good ratings were fairly similar over time, but where they did drop a little bit, both of them in this case, 7% from the spring was on the excellent rating. So we see personal support workers at 30% now, and the World Health Organization, a decline again to 10%. Now, in terms of politicians and how they're dealing with the pandemic, again, your eyes will probably go to the declines in the ratings. So most of these have declined, but I think it's important to underscore that particularly in some specific cases, and I'm thinking primarily of Premier Ford, for example, a 64% now and a decline of 19% is still a very strong, excellent and good job performance rating for Premier Ford. And so, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of mention that, because I think that seeing these, you might interpret that. But I think there's a little bit of fatigue. This has been something that has been going on for a long time. We also, I think, saw a shift in the focus over the course of the pandemic. Initially, we were all tuned to our televisions and following the guidance of the public health officials. And they were mostly leading the conversation, and the focus was on health. And then we saw in around June, things were shifting, and the pressure on the provinces and the premiers to reopen the economies and get things moving again. The economic dimension of the pandemic sort of became a little bit more front and center. And I think some of these premiers, came out of the shadows of the public health officials who had been leading the conversation. And I think that is a little bit perhaps of what is, might be explaining some of these changes. There's one other slide in terms of the change in impressions. The previous slide I showed was how impressions were based on their performance in handling the pandemic. This is the overall change in impressions just generally. And so some of these numbers are fairly consistent from one slide to the next. I would make note of Premier Horgan, whose numbers have increased, which is probably not surprising given the majority that he won in BC recently. The other one to flag is the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, who also had an increase over time. Obviously, we don't have a tracking number for the Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole, just because of the timing of our two surveys, but I think that these, are numbers for some that are quite good. And then perhaps for someone like Premier Kenney, we sort of see that his numbers were bad and they seem to be worse now. And so his are the ones to note that are not necessarily tracking in the right direction for sure.
So the bloom is off the rose a little bit. We've gone from this unprecedented levels of support for our political leaders. It's fallen down a little bit, but still very high. I mean, most political leaders would die for a 64% excellent good rating in terms of their performance. I want to come to Susan, because you've been observing politics and government's operations for decades. I mean, what do you make of all of this? I mean, who's managing this crisis well? Who isn't, and why?
Well, and thank you for including me in this. I'd be watching it riveted if I wasn't participating too. So thank you.
We should say also that Susan has written a book on public opinion research, Shopping for Votes. So unlike some of her colleagues, she actually really knows this stuff. So sorry to interrupt.
No, not as well as anybody on this panel, but if you had told me at the beginning of this pandemic that Jason Kenney was going to be the underperformer and Doug Ford would be the overperformer, I would have said, this is exactly opposite. Doug Ford has somehow, you know, we look into it a lot. Toronto Star, of course. There's been a new Doug Ford in all of this, and there has been. I would have expected that Jason Kenney would have taken his place as the leader of all the premiers in this. He has not, and after looking at these numbers this week, I did some asking around, including to your colleague Rick Anderson, brother of Doug, to people who deal with Alberta a lot. And I guess Alberta is kind of an outlier in all of throughout the pandemic. We've seen is, you know, it's not joining with the federal government on the COVID app, for instance. It has really positioned itself sort of in opposition to the rest of the provinces. And I think maybe it just might be the combative, contrary nature of politics in Alberta that we're seeing there, is that things are not good in Alberta, economically speaking. There may be viewers out there who know this way better than me. So I think the problem Jason Kenney has is that a bunch of circumstances have collided to make this a worse pandemic for him than it is for others.
And it's
But
interesting. So go
Yeah.
on, finish your thought there. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
It's interesting that you focus on those two, because pre-pandemic, you know, Doug Ford was seen as a loose cannon, kind of a, you know, short-fingered vulgarian, and Jason Kenney was considered to be a very astute, savvy politician. And what does this tell you about political style in Canada? What works in terms of political style? And is there a message here for Jason Kenney and Doug Ford about political style?
So I will admit that I am one of the viewers who does not miss a Doug Ford press conference. I've been, and it's a cliche almost to say it now, but authenticity has really worked for him. I think he talks about his mother-in-law in the long-term care home. He yells at the insurance companies. He says yesterday he's just fed up with things. I think people actually understand and can see themselves in Doug Ford's shoes. And he has also done a very interesting thing with the federal government during this. Who would have predicted that Doug Ford, who was the whipping boy of Justin Trudeau and the Liberals in an election a year ago?
Sure, absolutely.
I did a piece, I'm not sure whether we talked about this during the last webinar, but I did a piece on early in the pandemic about the friendship between Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and Doug Ford, which I am told remains now the second most read story in the Star's history. I don't know.
Because it fell under the stranger than fiction rubric. That's why no one believed.
But it tells me that people are looking for stories of politicians getting along. As sappy and as hallmark as that sounds, I actually think that collaboration is working for people.
And that's remarkable when we look south of the border in the polarization. I mean, Doug Ford's got to wake up and say, this being reasonable, compromising, rational, this actually works. Holy, Doug, wait in here. What do you want to add to this?
Well, I think the examples of Premier Kenney and Premier Ford are going to form any number of topics for dissertations going forward, because it's a lesson in political science one way or the other. Maybe the dust hasn't settled on what the outcome is in terms of whether constituents like it, but everything that we've seen so far suggests that one's own constituents prefer the approach that Premier Ford has taken to the approach that.
It could be Jason.
Figures, eh? To the approach that Premier Kenney has taken, and right now, I mean, the thing that struck me about this, the performance ratings, is that right now in Alberta, where we did an oversample of the population, by the way, so we'd have enough people to really analyze the results. Alberta is giving better performance ratings to the Prime Minister and the federal government than they are to their Premier and their provincial government. And that is just, I can't think of anything in the last 20 years where we would have seen that to be the case, let alone on the issue that people agree is the #1 issue of greatest concern to them.
So even in Alberta, that kind of combative posture is not resonating with the population at all. Let's move on, because we've still got a lot of data. As I mentioned, this is the second in a series. And so, Stephanie, why don't you just continue and show us how Canadians' attitudes have evolved in terms of their response to various measures and policies that have been put forward to manage and deal with the pandemic. Oh, you're on mute there.
I just realized I knew it was going to happen, and I apologize.
$10 in the mute
Oh,
jar.
absolutely. I also have to apologize. I guess I'm not sure if I'm sharing my screen right and people are seeing the wrong view. So I do apologize if you're seeing not the full screen. I wish I could figure that out on the fly. And so, yeah, so I've got just a few that I want to show you, because we were testing in spring and we did it again this fall, the support for different health measures. And what we're seeing is, in fact, they're widespread and rising. So it's so funny, because I think about when we first started compiling the data, and we produced a top line report, and Alan, you reached out and asked, can someone check these numbers? I think they've been coded incorrectly. Something's wrong here. And we were all kind of surprised to see how much public support there is now for some of these measures. And we think back, or you think back to even what we reported in the spring with respect to wearing, making masks mandatory. In the spring, this was at 45%. It's increased 32%. And at the time, we reported doing that as controversial. And essentially, I think back to that time, and we were all in our homes. No one was wearing masks. The people that you did see wearing them were people who had been traveling internationally, and you might have seen them at an airport. But it was sort of foreign, and people weren't sure why they would do it. And even there were questions about the efficacy of it. And so that was really interesting. But even things like physical distancing, limiting size of social gatherings, and banning large gatherings, there is, widespread support among Canadians for all of these measures. And I don't feel like, we also did some qualitative research this past July, and people were saying, I could see doing this for the foreseeable future and I would have no issue with it. It just sort of feels like part of our culture now, or just part of what we do to help each other out.
It's remarkable findings, because as you said, when we looked at them, the first is, this can't be right. I mean, we keep on hearing everything about pandemic fatigue. How can support for these measures that are basically restrictive actually be going up? And Susan, it really does speak to the Canadian socio-political culture. I mean, we're kind of relatively deferential to authority and rules. We see compromise over extremism. We talked about that in terms of performance ratings. And we're often prepared to put the good of the collective over the convenience of the self. But it also strikes me, looking at this, is that this mindset is a potential trigger for blame. That if others who are involved in this pandemic do not behave in a similar responsible fashion, look forward to us. I mean, we've talked about what's happened today. Who stands to really benefit from this crisis politically, and who stands to be in big trouble?
I think that's a really astute observation, Alan, about the blame business. And these numbers leaped out at me too, because I think what we're seeing right now is a tension. Oh, look, first of all, you see the public taking ownership of the measures to end this, right? But every day, as I watch the news conferences, I am watching an exchange between who's going to get the blame if this keeps going on.
Right.
And you see again Prime Minister Trudeau, or Premier Ford, or Premier Legault or Horgan getting more and more urgent every day and saying, look, you guys, if this goes on, it's kind of your fault. But they don't want to say it really that way. And you see the public increasingly, and I think this is the decline we're seeing too, in their support. People are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, you told us that this would be under control. And I really do think that what is going to motivate the second wave, this deep, dark winter, as everybody's talking about, is this tension between who's to blame if it goes on. It's
and that's very. Very interesting, because I mean, we know that crises in the moment helps incumbents, and we've seen three incumbents get reelected over the course of this pandemic. But we also know what happened to Winston Churchill after the Second World War, and you just wonder if the political dynamic might change tremendously over the next 6 months as a consequence of that.
Did you know, about 3 weeks into the pandemic, when I think we all thought we were going, I talked to somebody who was reasonably close to Trudeau, not one of his staff, a friend of his, who had been saying that the Winston Churchill example was in there, that they were very conscious of that at the outset of this, is that this is going to be a hard few months, and I who's going to end up? Here's my prediction is we're going to see the political approval levels go down further. I think no matter what, I think we are returning to normal that way. So I expect to see all of I think the trend lines that you're seeing there are going to continue. Jagmeet Singh, if he plays his cards right, could go up.
Talk to me more about that, because the NDP has been marginalized for the last 5 years, really trying to find some ground. It's not huge, but he's one of the only guys who's up over the last 6 months. What's happening there?
I think what he is, I think he's played this, and I hate when people say playing politics, because I think this is real. But I think what you're seeing there is he has decided it's a big risk to cooperate with the government. And this goes back to what we were talking about before, that people are rewarding cooperation right now. It's interesting that you don't see approval levels for Trudeau going up, but you see approval levels for politicians who are working with him, which is fascinating.
That's a very interesting observation. Sorry, Steph.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just gonna jump in, because I think that's really interesting. And there was something that we had been following previously in the spring as well around guaranteed annual income. And at the time, we had seen that 55% of Canadians supported that, and that number actually increased to 60% here in the fall. And not surprisingly, supporters of the NDP were at 79%. So I think that there's something to say about this context that we're seeing, this shift in people's views and their priorities that align a little bit more closely with the policies of the NDP as well, potentially. So that just occurs to me that these are the kinds of things people are thinking about and experiencing, and it just lends itself to their policies and their platform.
It goes back to this 3/4 of the population saying now is the time to really reevaluate what we're doing. And Stephanie mentioned the qualitative work that we did earlier in the year, and a lot of the questioning that's going on, the introspection that seems to be going on, does lend itself to a more progressive outlook, saying, I really worry more about vulnerable people than I did before. I wondered why I'm in this rat race going to the office in the car and congestion every day. Back on the performance stuff, we saw the long-term health sector with the lowest rating by far. And as part of this, we decided, well, let's take a deep dive and look at a little bit more detail on how people respond to what's happening in long-term healthcare and what they want in the future. And Doug has been doing a lot of that analysis. So why don't we go to you right now, Doug?
Okay. Yeah, this was one of two sort of deep dives on specific topics that we did this wave. And perhaps the most interesting and challenging of the data, challenging certainly if you're in the long-term care business, but also in terms of whether you're responsible for developing policy related to them. Because the data definitely shows that there are strongly held opinions, and they might not be deeply informed opinions. If we go to the next slide, we've got a very high degree of recall, 79% clearly recalling. that there were COVID outbreaks in long-term care facilities.
And we should put that in context. If we ask people, do you clearly recall what you did yesterday? It's unlikely that 79% would say yes. That's astronomical number for public opinion. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, basically all the rest said, oh, I vaguely recall that. And most of those people are recalling the right thing. So this is basically saying that the Canadian public is well aware of the fact that there were COVID outbreaks at long-term care facilities. And almost certainly resultingly, we've got 2/3 saying that their opinion of long-term care facilities has worsened as a result of the pandemic or over the course of the pandemic. So those two things don't add up to a very good environment for the industry. And as a result, we're also finding when we ask about what people want to have done in response is that the status quo is not an option. There's a level of demand for making some change. As I said a moment ago, the level of knowledge, however, in terms of what the situation is, suggests that the opinions are very strongly emotional, and I mean strong both in terms of the emotion is strong and the level of conviction seems to be fairly strong, that they want to see certain things happen. But you ask them whether the industry is regulated already, and what we find is an actual majority can't give you a firm answer one way or the other. Only 26% are confident that, yes, they are licensed and regulated. Another 45% are like, well, I think so. And you know that implies that they know, but they're really questioning themselves on that. I mean, if you said, is the taxi industry regulated, I don't think people are going to be as wrong as or as guessing as often as this 45% in this particular case. And it suggests that the knowledge is a little bit light about something that they obviously are caring a lot about right now. And in terms of what they want to see done, we're finding widespread support for the simple proposal of more regulation of long-term care facilities. What that means in this particular option was left undefined. So they definitely want to see something done. They'd like to see provinces work with the federal government on improving long-term care. This was put in the context of, would you like to see provinces do this on their own? It's their jurisdiction. Or would you prefer to see them work in collaboration with a federal government on some sort of federal framework, perhaps? Or would you prefer to see the federal government do it on their own? And virtually no one, like single digits, are saying they'd like to see the federal government handle this on their own. And a significant proportion are definitely saying that it's okay in the hands of our provincial government. But the majority here, as you can see, is saying, I'd like to see the provinces work with the feds on this. And in terms of ownership models, we asked people whether they had a preference for-profit or not-for-profit. And what we find here is 52% saying that they prefer not-for-profit over for-profit. And that's not to say that the other 48% are just picking the other option. In fact, fewer than a quarter were saying that they want the for-profit option, and the rest were saying, well, I either don't care one way or the other, or I don't have an opinion one way or the other. So that suggests that that the for-profit long-term care facility sector is probably facing the highest barometric pressure of public opinion. In terms of some more specific, if you can call these more specific examples of initiatives that could be taken, there's really uniform, widespread support and virtually no opposition to setting national standards or the vague notion of government investments in long-term care facilities, and equally for increasing the number of personal support workers in long-term care facilities. When you see numbers as uniform as that and blocks of the population saying, yep, do that, yep, do that, yep, do that, to us that usually says they're not really differentiating between these. And if they were forced to make a choice, I can't tell you whether they would choose one of these over the others based on these numbers.
But they're definitely saying do something.
Do something, exactly what they're saying. More sort of controversially or in terms of more interventionist policies like having the government take over all facilities or having the government take over facilities where there have been COVID-19 outbreaks in only those facilities. Again, we find a lot more support than opposition to that, more support than we might have surmised, but also no nuance of the distinction between whether this kind of takeover really should only apply to those that had problems with COVID, which suggests something else about the level of understanding of the market and whether there's some ability for citizens to say, oh, I know which ones don't perform so well on COVID prevention, and I know which ones are doing a great job on that. And if you can't tell, then your instinct is to just say, I can't tell, so take over all of them or regulate all of them.
Yeah, that lack of differentiation says pox on all your houses right now. Susan, I'm interested in seeing how you think this is going to unfold. I mean, is fixing long-term care going to have to be a top priority of all levels of government right across the country going forward? And if it is, what's that fix most likely to look like?
It's going to be interesting. I'll tell you how it could get interesting. I don't think you're going to see the federal government run in and take over things. All through this pandemic, Justin Trudeau has been wanting to remind people, those who remember, he's not his dad. He's not, he's a big provincial power guy. He has not invoked the Emergencies Act, which would be really bad given the 50th anniversary war measures. But he has not rushed in to have a Fed-Prov fight in all of this.
Right.
Within the next 2 weeks, though, we are going to be seeing a federal provincial First Ministers meeting on healthcare. The provinces have served notice that they want a lot more money. I actually went to their press conference just a few weeks ago over at the Chateau Laurier. If the federal government was smart, they'd say, you want some more money? I want to tie this to the long-term care discussion.
To the standards, the standards
the
issue.
Standards issue and fixing things. And I think that is an ace that the federal government, with these numbers like this, and it's seared into the public knowledge, I think that's a strong ace that the federal government brings to those discussions. And it'd be interesting to see how the provinces react to that too, because we saw this week a discussion on pharmacare, and all the provinces have been saying that's none of your business, Ottawa.
Well,
Right?
I would take that prognostication one step further. I mean, does this whole issue stand to change leverage between federal and provincial governments, and does it stand to raise new tensions in federal-provincial relations, the likes we haven't seen during the pandemic?
Yes, definitely. I think so. We've already seen that the cracks that I did a thing on the current. I remember this all the time. Just at the beginning of this year, a few of us went on the current to talk about what were going to be the big issues in 2020. Not one of us said a pandemic, by the way. And we all talked about national unity, that this was going to be huge. This was going to be a massive, massive fight. And it's possible that that we're going to start to see that emerge. I still don't know that it's going to be the fight that it would have been had the pandemic not occurred.
Interesting.
I still think it's interesting that Doug Ford's not the bad boy at the table, and we don't see Maclean's putting the resistance on its cover anymore. But I do think this long-term care discussion, healthcare discussion is far more interesting than it would have been had the pandemic not happened.
Very good, very good. The last section we're going to deal with is the tricky future of vaccines. Doug, continue on.
Okay, yeah, no, there are a few more questions we did on vaccines, but there's a couple that we want to highlight here for you, maybe four. First of all, vaccines do appear to be accepted as a potential game changer. But as you've probably seen in other studies, our own definitely uncovered, at least on the surface, the indication that there might be hurdles on the horizon, as we say. First of all, 89% is near uniform opinion on people believing that a vaccine is important, and almost as many are saying that it'll have a positive impact on combating the spread of the virus. So there's pretty widespread acceptance that a vaccine will have efficacy and that it matters. And at the same time, we've got 65% of the adult population in Canada indicating that they have at least some concern about the safety of a vaccine, which, you know, it tends to ring alarms of anti-vax mentality and concerns about whether we're going to get to whatever the threshold is that public health officials want us to get to for that herd immunity. And we do find in our survey 30% saying that they might not, likely will not, or definitely will not get the vaccine when it is available in Canada and approved by Health Canada. So that's not just a theoretical framework that we put in the question. It was like, okay, when Health Canada says it's ready, what will you do? And when we looked at those, it begged a lot of questions. And so we ran some crosstabs between the two. And one of the things that we found is that concern is not necessarily to be equated with resistance. If people were somewhat concerned, 70% of those people were still nevertheless saying that they intended to get vaccinated. So I think that that maybe what we're seeing here is a population that's been exposed to more information about the development and the rushed development of a vaccine than they've ever been exposed to in their lives. And they're hearing even respectable figures, if you can accept that, for Kamala Harris, for example, in the vice presidential debate, who said, if public health officials say I should get the vaccine, I'll be the first one in line. Whereas she added, but if Donald Trump tells me to take it, I ain't taking it. And what that indicates is that there's a level of trust attached to who it is that's telling you about this. And that trust then affects one's concern, relates to one's concern over the safety. And in the next slide, what we also uncovered, and this was just sort of a little bit of fancy, a flight of fancy, asking, well, what if it was a vaccine developed in Canada? Would that make you feel any better? And 58% saying, oh yeah, I would feel actually more confident in a Canadian developed vaccine, which, you know, adds more evidence to it's not really about vaccines. It's about how closely I'm going to pay attention to this vaccine. So I think the concern is there and it's legitimate and has to be addressed when the vaccine is available and distributed. These are questions that people are going to have, and they'll need to have answers that they'll find valid and credible and comforting. But it is definitely on their minds. In terms of time frame, and this was, you know, October 15th to 22nd. So there'd already been plenty of discussion about a vaccine being available in the coming months, if not weeks, as you know, some politicians in other countries were saying that a vaccine would be ready that quickly. We still find 38% of Canadians, when asked when they expect that it would be available to them personally, saying it'll be a year or longer, including some proportion, a small proportion, who feel like, oh, it'll never be available for me. So the expectations on timeline that look to us to be longer than the near term for a good chunk of people.
It's surprisingly patient. Again, probably reflecting again that the socio-political culture of Canada. Now, Susan, we've been told many, many times that one of the things this pandemic has done is exposed pre-existing vulnerabilities that we weren't particularly aware of. You know, part of that is we do virtually no R&D in vaccines in Canada. We have no manufacturing capability. Given that the vaccine does look to be on the foreseeable horizon now, I mean, is this going to put tremendous pressure on governments to change that, to make sure we're doing more R&D, more health capacity in this country?
Yeah, I find this so interesting, this part. First of all, it's like Aaron O'Toole, the Conservative leader, has been reading these numbers. He was asking just about this yesterday in the House of Commons to Trudeau, why don't we have our own vaccine? Why aren't we doing this in Canada, we're vulnerable. You saw, again, Doug Ford this week talking about how he's going to blatantly favor Ontario businesses now in government procurement. You saw Joe Biden doing Buy American. What's the link between all of this? We have become huge pandemic protectionists. We are very afraid of making ourselves vulnerable to anything that happens outside our borders. And I wonder, just as an aside, whether the reticence we're seeing on vaccines will be like the reticence on the masks of the previous poll you guys did, and that once it is actually real, that people will shed some of their reticence to it. But I think what you're picking up on here in this is this, and this is going to be a big problem in the pandemic recovery because we need the rest of the world, is that people are becoming very protectionist, and they're not making any apologies for it either. I was actually quite surprised.
No, and if Canada is at the back of the line as a consequence of not having that capacity, our earlier conversation about a shift to blame is going to happen pretty darn quick. I want to ask you, and I want to bring my research colleagues in on this too, because, you know, in public opinion research, you're often kind of, is that glass half full or half empty? I mean, Doug talked about 30% of the population saying they might not or won't take the vaccine. I mean, is that high? Are we going to have a take-up problem in this country, do you think, Susan?
I think, you know, we've seen that there has been a real reluctance, in fact, a refusal to even talk about the idea of mandatory vaccinations. You know, that we're just not going there. But again, like I said, 3 months ago, we weren't talking about mandatory masks either, or
Right. 4
or 5 months ago. So I do think, though, that it does, as you say, fit into this idea that it's going to be a dark, cold winter, and people moderate their views when they get together in groups. And if they're not getting together in groups all winter, if they're sitting by themselves, you know, strange and paranoid and weird thoughts can happen. If that it doesn't sound too pessimistic, but I do worry what people will be starting to think in isolation.
Stephanie, you want to weigh in on that at all?
I guess I was trying to square some of my thoughts about, you know, why people would not want to get vaccinated. And I'm sort of thinking about, you know, we all know we're supposed to be distancing. We all know we're supposed to be wearing masks, but at the same time, somehow our rates keep increasing. So what's going on that this is still happening? And so then I'm also trying to square, well, if that's the case, if people are thinking that they're not going to get it, I have no data to back that up. But if that's what's going on, do they think they won't need to be vaccinated? And I'd also be curious to know what's the take up on the seasonal flu shot, you know, and do they feel I'm trying to rationalize all those things. I just don't have the data at the ready, but that's the kinds of things that are going through my head.
Doug?
Well, I think that Steph's absolutely right, that there's got to be some degree of my personal context involved and related to this. I mean, let's not forget that there's a huge difference between urban and rural opinions in Canada, and we have like an 80-20 split. But the farther you are from a city, it's likely the case that it's the farther you are from an outbreak, and so there could be some correlation there. Between that kind of proximity and one's sense of well, is it really to me to get vaccinated? But I think
so. Rather than resistance, it might be just the acuteness of any sense of vulnerability.
A practicality, but also, I mean, we've heard about the Russian vaccine and
Sputnik.
We've heard of pauses on trials that make people like wonder because they've never been exposed to the process before. Is that a good thing, bad thing? You know, should I be scared of it if that ends up developing into the actual vaccine? So I think that even the most rational and devoted consumers of this kind of information are being given information that might cause them pause And it's going to be up to the public health officials to restore confidence and ensure that it is the highest possible, and that people don't feel that something has been, like a corner has been cut, or there's some side effect that is going to, turn up years from now. I mean, measles, mumps, rubella thing that has, a very small fraction of anti-vaxxers is a vaccine that has been around for a long time. So there's a lot of evidence about what that does. I mean, some of these questions are pretty rational.
Time's almost up. I want to have just ask each of you your final thoughts on what you're going to be looking for over the next 6 months. Susan, why don't we start with you?
I'm going to go back to where we started here. I'm really fascinated with this tension, which I don't think is contradictory, between people wanting the world we had and people wanting a better world. And I actually think my division in that is, I think people want personally the world they had, but they want the outside world to change. And where that takes people is going to be a fascinating discussion in the, as I said, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think this second wave is going to hit people hard, and the winter is going to hit people hard. And where we end up after that is worrying.
Stephanie, final thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I had written down, I'm thinking, about we're heading into the Christmas season. And if we are headed into another shutdown at the time when people most want to be with family and friends, you think about how is that second wave of isolation going to affect people, and where are we going to end up in terms of mental health, in terms of the economy, and what does this look like after, if there is a second shutdown, in terms of people's personal impact? Do we have bigger problems than we already have with the national debt, and on the economy front, does that get worse? And so I think there's just so much fluidity and so much uncertainty with this. It's so hard to predict, but I think there's a lot still that's going to happen.
That's pretty pessimistic. Doug, do you share that kind of outlook?
No,
both of you.
I mean, I don't share that particular dimension of pessimism, but it was the case that when we did this study in mid-October, that 2/3 of Canadians were saying the worst is yet to come. And at least in the short term, since we did those interviews, it has borne out to be true. I think the thing for me, one of the big takeaways from this study and the difference over the two waves is COVID has become the greatest health policy issue, and switched to the greatest economic policy issue. And now economic policy and social policy are blurred together, perhaps like never before in my lifetime. And how you handle the social policy has a lot more variation to it than how you handle, okay, everybody, you need to stay separated and cover yourself and not spread the virus. So the lines of tension in public opinion about how you handle the economic social crisis that are have been growing for 6 months and are only increasing. I think that's where opinions is going to start to divide more, and we're going to see erosion and debate, and let's call it healthy democratic debate, but probably tension.
Well, listen, it's been a great and substance-rich conversation. So much so that we didn't get to any of our audience questions. I really apologize for that. I'm terrible. I always forget to tell people that that's available and that we didn't get to it at all today. And I see that some of you have asked questions. I promise you, we will give you a written response to all of them, and/or you feel free to pick up the telephone and call any of us to discuss in more depth. But in the meantime, I really want to thank the panelists, Stephanie Constable, Doug Anderson, Susan Delacourt, and Hillary, come back here. And Hillary Martin, I say our rising superstar in the public opinion research group. And I also want to let you know that we will send you a link to this conversation for your viewing pleasure. The offer, as I say, to get back to you on your questions is genuine, and we will follow up on that. Our executive producer, Charles Bird, also forced me to remind everyone that today is the 157th anniversary of Lincoln's delivery of the Gettysburg Address. So with that, we're done. Be safe and be well, and thank you all very much.